Hello, welcome to my Approach to Assessment assignment presentation. In this presentation, I will attempt to demonstrate how I approach assessment as an educator and how I convey it to others. The essential question that I considered while making this presentation is how can assessment and instruction be integrated in the classroom to improve student learning? Growing Success states that the primary purpose of assessment and evaluation is to improve student learning. In this presentation, I will review how this statement is reflected in my practice. When planning and thinking of an essential question to begin my presentation, I was finding it difficult to separate my approach to assessment from my approach to instruction and pedagogy. I then remembered a discussion in our very first class about the relationship between assessment, instruction, and curriculum. Student learning and success are dependent on the successful integration of instruction, curriculum, and assessment. You cannot have one without the other. These three pillars converge to form student learning. Curriculum is what we teach, instruction is how we teach it, and assessment is our evaluation of the nature and degree of student learning. The book Teacher-Made Assessment describes this relationship using the metaphor of a three-legged stool. If one leg is missing, meaning if you fail to consider one of the three elements when planning, then the stool, or student learning, becomes unstable. This is a photo of my classroom at Glaston Public School. Each stool represents one of my students. In this presentation, due to the scope of the assignment, I will discuss both instruction and assessment in detail. I will briefly touch on curriculum, but it will not be a main focus. In 2010, the Ministry of Education released a new set of policy regarding assessment. Growing Success states 7 fundamental principles that all teachers should adhere to in order to engage in a rich practice that properly guides student learning. I will review each fundamental principle and explain how it has guided my practice thus far. Fundamental principle number 1. Transparency is achieved in instruction through the communication of the learning goals to the students using student-friendly language. In my curriculum and assessment plan, I carefully planned each lesson with the curriculum expectations in mind using backwards design. I considered how I would communicate the learning goals with the students and planned activities to meet each curriculum expectation. Fairness and equity are achieved in instruction through the use of Universal Design for Learning, UDL. My lesson plans are created with a high degree of consideration for the broad range of human ability, learning styles, age, culture, and socioeconomic backgrounds in mind. It is important to note, as stated in Learning for All, that fairness is not sameness. It is rather giving every student the opportunity to work at their own pace and capacity, and providing them with the proper tools for growth and success. I try my best to set up my classroom with UDL in mind, which will be touched on later in this presentation. This is to ensure that my instructional practices draw on the strengths and meet the needs of all students. Transparency is achieved in assessment according to Growing Success on page 7 when student learning is assessed and evaluated according to the clear standards outlined in the curriculum expectations provided in all curriculum documents for grades 1 to 12, and according to the 4 categories of knowledge and skills and the 4 levels of achievement outlined in the achievement chart that appears in every curriculum document. This can be done through the use of checkbricks or rubrics and proper consultation of achievement charts for each grade levels and subjects. Students can also be given the opportunity to contribute to the development of the success criteria. Fairness and equity are achieved in assessment when, according to Growing Success on page 8, all students are able to demonstrate their learning regardless of their socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, learning style, and/or need for special services. This can be done through thoughtful consultation of the student's IEPs, tiered assessments, assessment with multiple entry points, and assessments that offer a choice of different say, write, do components. Fundamental principle number 2. I support all students during instruction by planning each lesson with differentiated instruction and UDL in mind. This means that I design lessons that are dynamic and flexible to suit different learning styles and needs. I attempt to provide students with multiple means of representation, multiple means for action and expression, and multiple means for engagement during each lesson. I have created a class profile, which is a living document. I'm continually updating my class profile every time I learn something new about my students. I also consult my class profile during lesson planning and design so that I can be considerate and aware of that diversity in my classroom. The Differentiated Instruction Educator's Guide on page 5 states that differentiated instruction is a cyclical process of finding out about the learner and responding by differentiating. As we continue to learn more about the learner, we respond by differentiating instruction with increased precision and effectiveness. For example, I learned that many students in my science class were English language learners, and that there were other multilingual students who knew the same language as the English language learners. So, in collaboration with all the students in my class, I created a word wall with many different key words, each translated in the different native languages of my students. I support all students during assessment and evaluation by carefully reading students' IEPs and providing them with appropriate accommodations and modifications as directed. I say will because I do not yet have my own class and do not have very much experience in reading IEPs. I also support all students by providing them with multimodal assessment opportunities, providing them with the choice of a say, write, do component in each piece of assessment and evaluation. An example of this will be given later on. Finally, I also work on differentiating the content, process, and environment for the student to demonstrate their learning. This is so that all students can learn and demonstrate their learning in ways that suit their needs. Fundamental principle number 3. I ensure that my instruction practices relate to student interests, learning styles, needs, and experience by setting up my classroom with UDL and differentiated instruction in mind. By engaging students in different learning opportunities based on student preference. By giving students well-constructed choices that allow them to work on the same curriculum expectation in a variety of ways. I recently learned about choice boards, which I think are awesome ways to give students structured choice and cater to their interests. It is important that student choice is well structured and well constructed so not to overwhelm the students. The DI Educator's Guide on page 39 and 46 explains how choice is a good motivator and allows students to feel that they have ownership and control over their lives and learning. It also provides students with a personalized opportunity to connect their prior knowledge, interests, and learning preferences to the content. This is a photo of an example of a lab activity that I organized for a grade 8 class. There were 17 different lab stations, and students were able to choose to complete a minimum of 12 stations or more if they were wanted to or were able. This gave students the choice and control over their learning. Also, you will notice in the photo that some of the stations were reading material, some were listening to videos using Chromebooks, and some were hands-on with the microscopes. This allowed students to choose stations based on their own learning preferences. I ensure that my assessment practices relate to student interests, learning styles, and needs and experience by differentiating assessment based on student readiness, interests, and learning preferences. By giving students structured choice on how they demonstrate their knowledge of common curriculum expectations, and by using a variety of assessment types to guide lesson planning and differentiated instruction. This practice is supported by a statement in the DI Educator's Guide on page 21. This is a photo of an assignment that I gave to a grade 7 class. They were to use their knowledge of the characteristics of the Canadian rainforest ecosystem to create an imaginary creature that would have the suitable adaptations to live there. Students were able to showcase their creature in any way. Some decided to draw, some wrote a description and filled in a characteristics table, and others, not pictured here, wrote a short story about the life of their imaginary creature. It was up to the student to decide how best to demonstrate their learning. Fundamental principle number 4. I ensure that my instruction practices are communicated clearly to students and parents by clearly stating and posting the learning goals for each lesson, by trying my best to be approachable to students and giving them the opportunity to ask questions and ask for help. I will, when I have my own class, give parents the opportunity to ask questions and stay informed on their child's learning. I will, when the time comes, take the time and effort to write clear report card comments that are reflective of the student's learning skills and abilities. I ensure that my assessment and evaluation practices are communicated clearly to students and parents by clearly communicating the success criteria with students and sometimes allowing students to collaborate to develop the success criteria. By ensuring that assessment and evaluation is communicated reliably, by reviewing and proofreading individual test questions, prompts, and directions for systematic error, including grammatical or mechanical mistakes, cultural biases, and lack of clarity. This is described in teacher-made assessments on page 41. Also, by providing parents with multiple pieces of evidence of student learning, taking the time and appropriate effort to craft report card comments that are reflective of the student's knowledge and understanding of curriculum expectations. Learning for All on page 43 states the importance of ongoing communication between classroom teachers, the principal, the student's parents, other educators, and members of the in-school team. Also, Growing Success on page 8 states that studies show that students perform better in school if their parents or guardians are involved in their education. Fundamental principle number 5. I ensure that my instruction practices incorporate varied and ongoing assessment by carefully reviewing my curriculum and assessment plan to ensure that I have assessment opportunities in every lesson, and by integrating both assessment for and as learning activities into my instructional practices. For example, during lessons that are content heavy, I like to check for understanding at multiple checkpoints during the lesson. I find that there are many different drill and practice games that are fun and useful for students and teachers to check understanding. In my math practicums last year, I had students complete problems on mini whiteboards, and then they held up the whiteboard for all to see when they were finished. They could check their answers and receive immediate feedback. Sometimes students even gave each other feedback by noticing what someone else had written on their whiteboard, and then sharing solutions and strategies to solve the problem together. I also like integrating online quiz games such as Kahoot or Plickers. These websites allow teachers to see the distribution of class responses and give students immediate feedback. Teachers can then change the instructional plan based on student understanding or can revisit a concept if necessary. This leads to using assessment evidence to make short-term and long-term instructional decisions and remaining flexible to meet the needs of my students. The DI Educator's Guide on page 21 states that differentiated instruction depends on the ongoing use of assessment to gather information about student readiness, interests, and learning preferences. Teachers use this information to differentiate the learning environment, their instruction, and their assessment and evaluation. I ensure that my assessment and evaluation practices are ongoing and that students receive multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning by checking for understanding at multiple points in the lesson as described previously, developing assessment tools with reliability and validity in mind. When monitoring student achievement, I consult the students' most consistent and most recent grades in an attempt to see a clear and accurate representation of their learning. Finally, by allowing students to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of a particular curriculum expectation through formative and summative assessment of learning at many points during the unit in a variety of ways. For example, on a unit test, I will ensure that there are many different questions on the same curricular expectation and that those questions are in different forms. I also give students the opportunity to complete multimodal assessment tasks as seen previously with the rainforest example. Growing Success on page 39 says that using multiple sources of evidence increases the reliability and validity of the evaluation of student learning. Fundamental principle number 6. I ensure that the feedback that I deliver to students supports their learning by ensuring that it is descriptive and that students take the time to read and understand it. Many times I have noticed that students glance over feedback and just look at the letter or number grade on the paper. I find that it is difficult to deliver feedback in a way that is meaningful to students and that motivates them to advance their learning, especially in some of the older grades where students are worried about their average to continue with post-secondary education. For that reason, last year in a math class, I had students come up with a feedback chart or feedback journal. In this journal, they would write a strength from the feedback, a weakness from the assignment feedback, and an action that they were going to take to improve their learning before the next assessment piece. I also ensure that I deliver feedback in many ways through all types of assessment, both formally and informally. This refers to incorporating diagnostic or pre-assessment, formative and summative assessment practices into each lesson. For example, I've used Kahoot as a diagnostic assessment tool. I've launched a Kahoot game at the very beginning of a unit or lesson, and then used the same Kahoot later on. Students were able to see what they did not know at the beginning of the unit, and then how their learning had changed or advanced by the end of the unit. This allowed for students to see how much they have improved, learned, and advanced. Diagnostic assessment is a good form of feedback. It gives the teacher an idea of where the students are at in their learning and how to structure the lessons moving forward. It also helps the students understand what they know and where they need to focus their learning efforts. I would also like to mention here that I think feedback is an important tool for both teachers and students alike. Effective teachers adopt an inquiry-based approach. They can collaborate with their students and ask for input when designing instruction and assessment. In most cases, the students know themselves best. It is therefore important for teachers to listen to student voice. It will help them with UDL and differentiated instruction. Growing Success on page 6 says that the primary purpose of assessment and evaluation is to improve student learning. We should therefore listen to student voice. Fundamental principle number 7. I help students develop self-assessment strategies and become independent learners by modeling and teaching students how to deliver proper feedback so that they can engage in self and peer assessment. By using specific instructional practices that allow students to engage in assessment as learning, by helping students create SMART goals based on their feedback, and by modeling and teaching inquiry-based learning to help students develop metacognitive and reflective learning skills. In conclusion, my approach to assessment is carefully planned with equal consideration of instruction, curriculum, and assessment practices. I integrate those 3 elements in my planning to effectively guide student learning. The 7 fundamental principles guide how I, as an educator, plan my assessment and instruction practices. I thoughtfully consider the diverse needs of students when planning instruction and assessment. I set up the classroom with universal design for learning and differentiated instruction in mind. I try my best to give students structured choice on how and what they learn, as well as provide students with multiple opportunities to demonstrate and evaluate their own learning through the use of assessment as, for, and of learning strategies. Finally, I believe in 360-degree feedback, meaning that feedback is cyclical and that everyone should have equal opportunity to provide constructive feedback on the student's learning. Everyone, meaning students, teachers, parents, principals, or other educational support staff. Parents, teachers, and other staff should remain in constant communication and should collaborate to ensure that the student feels supported and that they have all of the tools that they need for success. Thank you.